Hi, so today I'm going to be discussing the alternate timeline of what if Henry V had lived for another 30 years. So instead of dying in 1422, he would have died in 1452. I am only going to focus on what would have happened in terms of the Hundred Years' War, in terms of France, because I quite like that part of history, and in terms of English politics, that's kind of harder to think because the Wars of the Roses kind of ensued after Henry V died, leaving a 9-month-old Henry VI. And if Henry V died in 1452, well, Henry VI would have been 30 years old, and I don't think there would have been such a problem. Now, English history would be quite different, but that is, if you want me to make a video on that, I will at some point probably, unless, yeah. But today is just going to focus on France. So we have to remember that in Battle of Agincourt happened in 1415, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, 1415. And then he continued his campaign with France. It was quite successful up until 1418, where it ended. Then he signed the Treaty of Troy, I think it was. I always get the treaties mixed up. But that treaty stated he would marry Catherine of Valois, and he would also rule France once the King of France died, Charles VI. But he signed this in 1420, but he died in 1422 of dysentery, just a few months before the King of France himself died. And well, he did marry Catherine of Valois, and she did have Henry VI, and she would have then go on to marry Owen Tudor, whose grandson was Henry VII. But of course, this alternate timeline did not happen because Henry V, he lived. He didn't catch dysentery, and he continued on with the French campaign. Now, he would have gone onto the throne of France, but not without a position, because by the time the Hundred Years' War came around to like the Treaty of Troy in 1422, it had been going on since 1346. Yes, around that time. So almost 100 years, and the 100 Years' War obviously ended further on, but in this timeline, the 100 Years' War was still going on, as was in normal history, but now with an English king on the French throne. Now the French, they did not like the English, as you can probably tell, but by this point they were really firm in their identity, and they had fought for 80-something years. They were not going to back down now. Had this happened in 1380, for example, probably, I mean, who knows, probably the French would have maybe not accepted, but not put up as much of a resistance to an English king on the French throne than if this happened in 1422. So it is entirely possible that Henry V would have faced quite a significant amount of rebellions, assassination attempts. He would have faced increasing opposition. Because the guy was quite harsh on the French, so he probably would have imposed high taxes, would have imposed harsh punishments towards the French, favored the English living in France, allowed for some English people to move to France, and, well, eventually things would have boiled onto quite certain tensions, and a rebellion, a big one, would have ensued. Now, I don't know, this is counter history, this is an alternate timeline, if this rebellion was strong enough. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that it would have overthrown Henry V. In this timeline that I am, because it can branch off in many ways, but in this branch, Henry V manages to escape to England. He lost the French throne, and that would have gone on to to Charles VII, and that would have gone on as normal. Henry V would have returned to England and just faced quite significant humiliation there. But it is entirely possible that the French, once they kind of got the things together, would have gone on to invade England again. Because at this point, it was mostly the English going against like the French, attacking the French. But at this point, for let's say, I don't know, 1430, the French said, that's it, we're taking England. And at this point, a new stage of the 100 Years' War would have happened because both armies were weak. Like I said, 90 years of war would have been a stalemate, but it would have just been constant fighting, bloody battles, blah, blah, blah. And it would have been, instead of on French soil, on English soil. And it would have gone on periods of fighting, more and more periods of fighting, until one of the successive monarchs died. Charles VII, I don't remember when he died, but I don't remember on the time period. But let's say it's 1452, and well, for some reason, Henry V dies. Henry VI would have taken the throne. And, well, he would now be a 30-year-old man, quite established, would have been hearing his father's advice, and he wouldn't be under the influence of other people like he was in the actual history because he was just a child. And probably at one point, the King of France would have probably tried attacking England again because, hey, new king. But I doubt they would have gotten anything. And yeah, they would have reached a treaty and the war would have ended there. And that is that. And then there's the other, because there's two options. That's the one I described, the Henry V, he gains the throne of France, then is overthrown and then goes back to England. And then there's the other option, which I do believe would be, equally as likely. Like I said, it's counter history, it's not actually happened, but let's say Henry goes on and says, hey, I have this treaty saying I am king now. And the French say, sure, but no, go back. And they would have allowed him to take the throne. They would have probably crowned Charles VII. It is Charles, right? I think it's Charles. I always get the names mixed up because there's so many. It's not Louis, but it may have been. It's probably Charles. Anyway, well, they would have said no, and more fierce fighting by the English would have ensued. But at this point, it's like with the other alternate timeline, they weren't gonna get anything. It's just two dudes just hitting each other like with their armies, trying to conquer each other's country without really getting anywhere. And we've been constant fighting until another treaty was signed. Because I doubt they would have kept on the war going for another 30 years with the same monarchs. So I think it would just be, in both cases, it would have ended with a lot of fighting until at one point someone said enough and would have, ended the war. And yeah, that is the possible scenarios, I think, that could have happened if Henry V had lived for another 30 years. I mean, a whole other deal could have said if the French king would have done the same thing, but the 100 Years' War was, for the most part, as far as I understand, the English hating the French, and the French reciprocating the feeling. It's not the French hating the English and then the English trying it the other way around. So that's what I think would happen. Honestly, I prefer the version that Henry V gets crowned king, and then he gets dethroned in France, and he has to go back to England and move from there and continues the war, and just same thing happens, but just delayed for a few years, and he gets to be king of France, but then gets kicked out. The whole Joan of Arc thing would have still happened because she wasn't directly it wasn't influenced by Henry V dying, is because she wanted the rightful king of France to be crowned. So that would have still happened. And it would have happened, I think, in this timeline, the one where Henry V gets crowned, kind of the Great Schism, in which Henry V would have been crowned. But at the same time, Charles VII, or whatever, I'm so sorry, I know the English monarchs, I don't know the French one. I think it's Charles VII, but and then Charles VII, the Dauphin, would have been crowned, and it would be two rightful kings being crowned, and it would end up being like a short version of the Wars of the Roses, because that was kind of what happened. Henry VI got crowned, but then Edward IV was like, yeah, no, I'm the king. And that kind of happened. I think that would have happened, but in France. But rather than Henry VI, Edward IV, Henry VI, Edward IV, it would have been, well, Charles VI, Henry V, Charles VII. You know what I mean? He would have been kicked out. And would have tried regaining the throne, but he wouldn't have gotten it. Now, like I said before, this is what if, this is more, wouldn't have been cool if this had happened. But of course, if you think of, let's say, this is like the sacred timeline, I am referencing Loki show, if anyone's watching this, all the videos I'm doing and will do for the foreseeable future have a slight influence on, have been influenced by Loki, the TV show, because they're all related, kind of. Really, really loosely related, but they are. Anyway, let me continue. I digress. So you have the sacred timeline, that's the actual history happened, but then you have a nexus event, like a branching of the timeline, and this is Henry V not dying of dysentery. He's been cured, or he didn't do something, and that would have done a branch. And this would be the new timeline. So they have this, the sacred timeline, and then the branch version. And then in this branch version, you have two possibilities. Let's say the straight one is Henry V gets crowned king, actually manages to get crowned king, and rebellion and civil war ensues. And that's one of the threads. And then the other one that branches up from that could be that Henry V goes to get crowned, but then they don't let him get crowned, and so he keeps on the war. And then let's continue going on. The Henry V gets crowned. We have a rebellion kicks him off and has to go back to England, or a rebellion happens, but he stays on the throne. And then if we continue on he kicks him out, he does another rebellion or another war against France and manages to regain the throne, or he has to go back to England, and then in that sense, he stays in the throne of England, or the French overthrow him in England, and then the French take over England. I've said England a lot. It's constantly branching off, and if you think about it, history is like that. It's just different paths that could have gone completely other way, and that's why I like the alternate timeline idea. But yeah, that is it. That is what I think would have happened if Henry V had lived for, let's say, another 30 years. It could have been, a different amount of time. I think by the time he died, he was 36. Although I may be wrong on that. He was 36, so he would have lived to 66, which is quite a nice age for the time period, considering this is the 15th century we're talking about, and not nowadays. Nowadays, 66 would be retiring age, but young. But back then, you reach 66, you're set. You you've lived life to the fullest. So that is it. Kind of an informal video, this one. I'm not looking at anything. There's no computer or anything. It's just all in my head, which is kind of cool because I haven't done this. I did this in one video, American of Scots, and even then I had memorized the entire thing. Here I just read a couple of articles, looked on a couple of websites, and then just rolled with it. But I mean, you can research it. It's probably gonna back what I say. And if you know anything about Henry V and then the 100 Years' War, you're gonna see where I'm coming from. It's not like I'm completely guessing. I've done my reading, thank you very much. And I've also, done the whole video series on 100 Years' War, and that video I have on if the King on Netflix was accurate. And there I basically talk about Henry V and Agincourt. So that is it. So yeah, I thank you for have you liked it? We found you liked it, you found it interesting. And yeah, thank you for watching. Bye.